The Syrian armed forces continue to carry out qualitative operations to clean Aleppo from mercenary terrorists. Lavrov says that Western countries try to achieve their temporary goals at the expense of and interests of the Syrian people. Khamenei says US, Israel, and those following them are behind the crisis in Syria. And the non-aligned movement statement expresses rejection of interference in Syria's internal affairs. Good afternoon. The 16th Non-Aligned Movement Summit concluded its activities in Tehran by ratifying the final documents unanimously by the representatives of the 120 member countries.
The Iranian President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad said that the countries that are participating in the 16th Non-Aligned Movement Summit in Tehran affirmed the adherence to the principles of the Non-Aligned Movement more than ever. In a speech at the closing session of the summit, Ahmadinejad said that these countries' participation stresses the need for the joint global governance, rebuilding the international order, making radical changes in the way the world is being run, and guaranteeing the participation of everyone in this process on the basis of justice and love, which will achieve peace. The Iranian president said that all the participating members affirmed the need to preserve the noble values of preserving human dignity, human rights, religious values, justice, and morals, and that they emphasized the need to confront the unilateralism and hegemony, avoid encouraging violence and conflicts, and resolving disputes and challenges through dialogue. He also announced that the next Non-Aligned Movement Summit will be held in Venezuela. During the summit, the supreme leader of the Iranian Islamic Revolution met with Prime Minister Dr. al-Halaqi. He stressed Syria's right to defend itself and confront the terrorist operations that are being carried out by the armed terrorist groups, reiterating Iran's support for Syria in confronting the terrorism that it is facing. He said that the West and Israel and those following them are behind the crisis in Syria that is aimed at undermining the resistance. Meanwhile, the Iranian president's assistant for international affairs said that his country rejects any foreign interference in Syria's internal affairs. During his meeting with al-Halaqi in Tehran, he stressed support for the Syrian government's efforts to halt the violence and solve the Syrian crisis peacefully through dialogue. The Iraqi Prime Minister Nouri Maliki reiterated his country's rejection of the foreign interference in Syria's domestic affairs, indicating that what is happening in Syria poses great dangers for the region and for the world. Meeting with al-Halaqi in Tehran, he called on encouraging the dialogue among all the parties in Syria, voicing Iraq's readiness to help in pushing the dialogue and the political process in Syria through the proposal on forming a contact group on the Syrian crisis. For his part, the Cuban Vice President, José Ramón, said Cuba has a duty to play in supporting the role of Syria in view of the distinguished bilateral relations. During his meeting with Premier al-Halaqi in Tehran, he said that Cuba has decided to support Syria and defend its sovereignty to prevent any foreign interference.
The United Nations Security Council held a session yesterday called for by France to bargain on the suffering of the Syrians caused by the terrorism financed and supported by France and its Western allies and regional tools.
The words delivered by the representatives of the enemies of Syria during the session aimed at mixing the cards and denying their responsibility in the crisis suffered by the Syrian people and raising the morals of the terrorists operating at their orders and encouraging them to continue the acts of violence and terrorism. Syria's ambassador to the United Nations, Dr. Bashar al-Jafari, underlined during his speech that some countries view the humanitarian aid from the perspective of their own political agendas. Al-Jafari wondered how some Arab and Islamic countries could talk about providing humanitarian aid to Syria and shed tears over the humanitarian condition of some Syrian people, while these countries had never offered any contribution to the humanitarian response plan that was signed between the Syrian government and the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. Ambassador al-Jafari also underlined that no country could permit the terrorists and the mercenaries to control the cities, or they cannot abandon the responsibility to protect the citizens, quoting many official statements issued by some Arab regional and international officials in support of the armed groups in Syria. Al-Jafari highlighted that the Syrian positive response to the cooperation with Kofi Annan, the resigned United Nations envoy to Syria, and adoption of his six-point plan, not to mention Syria's welcoming of the Geneva Action Group's final statement and the acceptance of al-Khudar al-Ibrahimi as the appointment of the special representative for the United Nations Secretary General to Syria. Al-Jafari also talked about the miserable conditions of the displaced Syrians in the countries neighboring Syria, calling on those countries to allow the displaced who want to return to their homeland Syria to come back. He also quoted the French foreign minister's earlier statements that were made on July the 29th, in which he spoke about the delivery of weapons by Qatar and Saudi Arabia and other countries to the armed groups in Syria, calling on France, therefore, to shoulder its responsibility as a United Nations Security Council permanent member and to respect the international law and the United Nations Charter. Al-Jafari also talked about the role played by the Turkish government in the crisis in Syria as the main partner in shedding the Syrian blood. On his part, the ambassador of Russia, Vitaly Churkin, condemned the calls by some countries to provide aid to the armed terrorist groups in Syria, calling for the full commitment to the principles of neutrality and honesty. Churkin pointed out that the level of the violence in Syria aggravated due to the stances taken by some members of the United Nations Security Council. On his part, the permanent representative of China reiterated China's support for the political settlement by the Syrians themselves in Syria and opposition to whatever foreign-imposed solutions there are. Meanwhile, Mohammad Jawad, the deputy foreign minister of Iraq, called for ending the violence and preparing the necessary atmosphere for starting a political process agreed upon by the Syrian representatives and with the representatives of the people, leading to the realization of the Syrian legitimate aspirations in preserving the security and stability of Syria and in the rest of the region's countries. Jawad called for halting the foreign mediation in Syria's affairs because they are aggravating the crisis and the humanitarian situation.
Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov says that the differences between Russia and the Western countries over the crisis in Syria are deep.
Addressing the students and the professors of the International Relations University in Moscow today, Lavrov underscored that only the Syrians are capable of solving the crisis in Syria, far from any foreign interference. He expressed confidence that the only available solution is the one which the Syrians adopt, and they should decide their destiny by themselves, pointing out that the Security Council has no authority to pass any solution on the country or to support the foreign interference in the country's affairs. Lavrov added that some Western and regional countries insist on the flagrant military intervention in Syria's internal affairs, while Russia and China and other countries insist on the need for halting the acts of violence and finding a peaceful solution to the crisis in Syria. Lavrov also stressed that it is not objective to ask the Syrian government to unilaterally pull back the military forces and vehicles from the cities.
Algerian Foreign Minister Mourad Metlisi called for non-interference in Syria's internal affairs, saying that the crisis in Syria should be resolved by the Syrians themselves. Metlisi stressed that the crisis in Syria must be dealt with by the Syrians themselves, and that foreign military intervention, as he called it, would lead to further violence in the country. He called upon the regional organizations to play a positive role in this issue and foster negotiation and dialogue between the Syrian government and the opposition. Security forces at dawn carried out an operation against terrorists behind Souq al-Hal area and killed a number of them. Syrian army units ambushed the terrorists near Kafr Hamra and destroyed their cars while they were trying to enter Aleppo. Another unit clashed with a number of terrorists in Bab Antioch in the old city of Aleppo and killed a number of them. A unit of the Syrian Arab Armed Forces clashed with terrorists near Jamal Mosque in Al-Kallasa neighborhood in Aleppo. The clash resulted in the killing and injuring of a number of terrorists. Earlier, security forces destroyed a number of cars equipped with Doshka machine guns for terrorists in Aleppo countryside. A source in the city said that a large number of terrorists were confronted and killed as they were coming from the Hayyan area and countryside of Aleppo. In Homs, a unit of the Syrian Arab Armed Forces clashed with an armed terrorist group in Al-Khandaq street in Bab Houd neighborhood, killing and injuring its members. Meanwhile, an army unit raided a den for an armed terrorist group in the town of Ibil in the countryside of Homs, inflicting heavy losses upon its members. A source in the city said that the army unit seized an amount of various types of weapons, ammunition and advanced communication devices in the terrorist den. During clearing the aforementioned town, the army members found a number of explosive devices planted by terrorists and dismantled them. The source added that a unit of the armed forces pursued the fleeing terrorists in Jurat al-Shayyah in the city of Homs and killed a number of them. In Hama, the armed forces cleared the towns of Qalat al-Madiq, Tuwayneh, al-Shari'a, Maidan, Ghazal, al-Hamra and Qarajulan in the countryside of the province from terrorist groups. The competent authorities clashed with terrorists in Tariq al-Saad, a neighborhood in Daraa province, as they were pursuing remains of the armed terrorist groups that were attacking locals, killing many of them and wounding others. Among the terrorists killed were Omar Mustafa Masalmi and Layth al-Muhammad. About 225 citizens who took part in recent events in Syria and were not involved in killing acts were released today. At the police command in Damascus, the released citizens pledged to return to their normal lives to contribute to building their homeland, stressing that freedom does not lie in devastating and destroying public properties. In Daraa also, about 54 citizens who were involved in al-Hirak events and did not use weapons were also released. A memorial service was held yesterday to mark the passing of 40 days since the martyring of Lieutenant General who succumbed to the wounds caused by terrorist bombings that targeted the National Security Building in Damascus.
During the services, which were held at the Officers' Club in Damascus, the speeches were delivered commemorating the life of Turkmani and his service for the country that lasted for over 55 years in the Syrian army, with the speeches affirming that the blood of the Syrian martyrs is strengthening the country's dignity and its immunity. Also on Friday, the funeral services for General Nabil Zalab and his family, who were murdered by terrorists in Bab Tuma area, were held at the Holy Cross Church for the Greek Orthodox in Damascus. During the services, the assistant of the Antioch and all the East for the Greek Orthodox, Archbishop Luke Al-Khoury, prayed for the peace in Syria and for the restoration of tranquility and closeness among the Syrians. Al-Khoury said that Martyr Zalab was a faithful man to his family and to his country, and that he was a creative man who gave from his knowledge. He also said that the Syrians' love for their homeland is deeply rooted and it cannot be shaken, telling all of those who are conspiring against Syria that the Syrians live together and die together, and they are strong because they are righteous.
Six Turkish soldiers were wounded in a blast that targeted their vehicle in Van province. The Turkish Hurriyet newspaper said that the vehicle was targeted by a remotely detonated explosive device on their way to the scene of an earlier explosion. The newspaper added that the soldiers are in a critical condition. Thousands of Bahrainis took to the streets in response to a call by the opposition under the slogan of freedom and democracy, demanding the release of activists detained in the jails of the Bahraini regime. Eyewitnesses said that the demonstrators were holding Bahraini flags, photos of the jailed opposition leaders, and photos of the activist Nabil Rajab. In a statement, the opposition warned against the continuous attempts to unjustly exploit the judicial system against the opposition to detain symbols of the opposition. It is to be noted that the demonstrations came after 2 months of prohibition and despite the oppressive measures taken against the peaceful demonstrators. Now over to Khalid Saqabani with the economic news. For more information, visit our website in English, www.syriaonline.sy.